Welcome back, everybody, to the fourth and penultimate episode in our series on the Great Awakening. For anyone new around here, you should know that a foggy day on Olympus is the place to get utterly dispassionate judgments about history, religion, and culture and why they matter. My name is Mike Pierce.
And my name is Coel Campo, and it's my job to remind Mike that it's a foggy day, so we can do no more than attempt impartiality, but we do at least try anyway. Now, as our more savvy viewers will quickly have guessed, the intriguing title, Blind But Now I See, is of course a line from John Newton's famous hymn, Amazing Grace. And so Newton and the campaign to end slave trade are definitely going to be included here. But this is really just one part of a growing wave of evangelicalism that was starting to bring really serious social change on both sides of the Atlantic, right?
Exactly. Yeah. One of the things we want to puncture is the heroic myth of the Great Awakening, that swift transformation was brought about by Wesley, Whitefield, Edwards, etc. It wasn't. And just to read a brief quote here from that illustrious tome, The Age of Reason, encapsulating this point. It would be no caricature to say that, insofar as run-of-the-mill evangelicals today have a distinct image of the Great Awakening, it's been picked up by anecdotes in sermons they have heard, or among the more serious-minded from popular biographies of Wesley, Whitefield, or Rowland. The resultant popular evangelical image consists broadly of three crucial elements: an utterly wretched, spiritually bankrupt national church before the Awakening because of the absence of godly ministers, vast numbers of converts during the Awakening, all converted by heroic preachers during meetings of cataclysmic spiritual power and emotional fervor, and a transformed country afterwards as a direct result of the ministries of Wesley, Whitefield, and co. That this vision is, as often as not, perpetuated by the instruction available in colleges that train evangelical preachers is no doubt a mere accident.
Now, that is a great quote, but you're really plugging your book in this series, aren't you?
And quite deservedly, because I'm sure you will agree.
Of course. We need to remember that until Wesley died in 1792, Methodism, which we're going to look at first, was a movement within the Church of England.
Which, amongst much else besides, made it unpopular among many Americans during the Revolutionary War.
But it recovered afterwards.
Oh, yes, so did the Church of England, and so did pacifist groups like the Quakers and Mennonites, who made people angry during the war by treating the injured and looking after fugitives from both sides. And once the war was over, all those groups carried on much as before.
We Americans are such a forgiving people.
Ha! The Revolutionary War generated far less real bitterness than the War of 1812.
That was because you burned down Washington.
Me? I wasn't even born then.
Oh, really? Because I seriously thought you were.
And somebody or other's ancestors were still skulking in Italy. Look, can we get back to the point here, Mrs. Campo?
Oh, yes. You were saying something about Methodism.
Exactly. Yes. Wesley dies 1792. 3 years later, Methodists partly jumped, partly kicked out of the Church of England.
And then they really start splitting and squabbling. It's not very impressive, is it?
No, not really. But we need to consider the reasons for it, and they center on Wesley's ambivalent legacy. First off, he's an evangelical within the Church of England, but in his theology, he's Arminian.
Now, you better remind us why that's an odd combination.
It's not an odd combination, say, to be an Arminian in the Church of England, but it is to be an evangelical in the Church of England and an Arminian, because for reasons we've rehearsed in other episodes. Essentially, the whole point of Calvinism is that you can't know who is amongst the elect, who is saved. And so you can have a national church along with an evangelical idea about salvation. Right? But if you have evangelical ideas about salvation and you're an Arminian or any kind of free willer for that matter, then that implies a believer's church, which Wesley certainly did not believe in.
And like you said, we have talked about this before. So if you as the viewer are looking for further exposition on that point, you should go back to the second episode in this series. And we really look at the squabble between Wesley and Whitefield there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Secondly, Wesley was emphasizing biblicism and preaching, but also high church sacramentalism.
And by sacramentalism, we mean the small c Catholic view that sacraments convey grace in and of themselves.
That's right. Yeah. And that doesn't fit very easily with the other stuff.
Right.
And if you hold that, then perhaps sacraments are more important than preaching. And the reason that Wesley held all this stuff together somehow is really because he inherited, as it were, the sacramentalist opinions from his father Samuel, who was a high church Anglican. And that, again, is really where those opinions belong.
Makes for a pretty odd mix, doesn't it?
Right, yes. Thirdly, he was ignoring or circumventing much of the Church of England institutional structure. And yet somehow he was a fiercely loyal member of the Church of England. He's a populist demagogue, but he's politically Tory and strongly royalist. Those don't really go together. And he's encouraging popular participation in church, but in his own person, he's a clerical autocrat. Now, the result of all this is that Methodism, when it does finally break away, has no very clear ecclesiology.
Yeah, and for the maybe non-theologues among us, ecclesiology just meaning one's theology of the church, like what a church is or should be, etc.
Yes, and that is by no means clear in Methodism. People who watched the first episode in this series might remember that the only qualification for belonging to the classes, the Methodist classes, was that one had a desire to save one's soul. That was it.
Right.
And so this leaves him with a very contestable legacy. And surprise, it was contested. So the practical results of all of this, Methodism tended to be under central leadership and insisting upon its right to appoint local ministers once it was a separate denomination. But it had an ethos at the grassroots that constantly chafed against that kind of restrictiveness, and that led to frequent breakaways. The denominational leadership also reflected Wesley's own politics, but it led a membership which during the 19th century drifted leftwards. So here are at least some of the main branches of British Methodism, or the breakaways at least, from the central stream. So as early as 1797, so just 2 years after leaving the Church of England, Alexander Killam broke away to start the Methodist New Connection. And the reason was that he and others like him wanted more congregational autonomy, not to be told what to do by Central Conference. In 1806, there was a smaller breakaway, the Bible Christians. They were not really a split, but they were Methodist in all distinctives, and they're strong only in Devon and Cornwall. And you can see the numbers, even by 1900, are pretty small there. In 1811, the most important split happens, and that's led by Hugh Bourne and William Clowes, and they were expelled for holding open-air revivalist meetings. like early Methodists. And that leads to the birth of the primitive Methodists, which is the largest secession, and it's also the most strongly working class Methodist group.
This sounds like a classic example of how churches really just drift away from their own roots over time.
Yeah, they do. And it's always in the direction of more structure and more institutionality.
And then that drift provokes renewal or primitivist movements.
Yep. And just in case, I don't know, some Catholics or high church people are watching here, not just among evangelicals, it was the same story with monastic movements in the late Middle Ages and the Reformation era.
Right.
The same kind of stuff going on. There were other splits in the 1820s to 40s, and secessions tended to follow the insistence of conference on imposing its will on the local society, with some local societies then saying, blow this for a game of soldiers, we're off, we're going to do our own thing. Yes. And the epitome of the clerical autocrat in charge of Methodist conferences, this man, Jabez Bunting. What a wonderful name that is. So, an autocrat after Wesley's own heart, but with little of Wesley's charisma or compassion.
Right. Okay, so to turn now to the Baptists and see what happens there. In the first episode of this series, we noted how both kinds of English Baptists had got themselves into a terrible mess by the early 18th century.
Yeah, they had. The particular Baptists, they're the Calvinistic kind, had veered off into hyper-Calvinism, which is not, as some people think, simply a rude term about Calvinism. It really is a thing, which we explained in the first episode. It's taking Calvinism and its logic to the point where you say there's no point in evangelizing because God's already decided who's going to be saved. And the rather obvious consequence of that is there are no converts, and over time, churches shrink. And that's exactly what did happen. And amongst the general Baptists, the non-Calvinistic Baptists, most of those veered off into Unitarian heresy, so highly rationalistic. And the two guys we've got here are the principal champions of rescuing whatever was left for some kind of sanity. So Andrew Fuller is the person who is principally responsible for dragging whatever was left of the particular Baptists towards some kind of evangelical version of Calvinism. And Dan Taylor rescued the last remnants of the general Baptists who hadn't become Unitarians. And the point I want to make about both of these is that they were motivated by seeing what had been done by the Methodists. They were instilled by the evangelical impulses of the Great Awakening and then applying that to their own denominations and turning them into evangelical outfits. While we're considering Baptists, we cannot possibly neglect this man here.
Yeah, this guy is one of the most famous Baptists ever.
Yeah, he is. He's generally hailed as the father of modern missions, which is perhaps a little bit myopic by evangelicals because Catholics can say, hey, we've been doing this stuff since the 16th century. And even Quakers had tried something in the 17th century, mostly suicidal missions to Egypt. And even the Pietists had got in to parts of the Caribbean and to Greenland, actually, which is much in the news in the week that we're recording this. But the title isn't totally misplaced. Now, he comes from a particular Baptist background. And when he stood up at a regional meeting to say, look, I think what God wants us to do is to send missions to India, he was told, young man, sit down. If God wants to save the heathen, he can do it without your agency or mine. There's a more or less perfect expression of hyper-Calvinism. But he's the first missionary of the Baptist Missionary Society, which is founded in 1792. He went to India. He had only a basic education. Mostly he was self-educated. But he had an incredible impact there. And his principles of founding missions, in my observation, have yet to be learned by many missionaries today. Right? His principles were that you go to wherever you're going to, you get right into the culture, you learn the language, you evangelize using whatever means are available, and you build a church at the earliest possible point. But by building a church, we're talking about people here, not a structure, and bring up local leaders because they will understand the culture and the local people better than you ever will. So he got a handle on all of that. He also undertook a number of translations of the Bible into local languages. The first attempt was a complete disaster because, of course, he didn't really know anything about the theory of how languages worked. And he produced a New Testament that was entirely unintelligible, and he had to go back and start all over again. But he'd learned his lesson, and he did several other translations after that. So the man is a total hero, yes. Before he went, this was his famous publication, an inquiry of the obligation of Christians to use means for the conversion of the heathen.
Yeah, and he says use means, so in other words, to actually do something about it, which was very revolutionary.
Yes, the title is somewhere between dull and almost laughable, because that is exactly what it means. That, my gosh, we should actually do something about this. But
Right.
he was pushing back on a climate of opinion in his own denomination that said, no, you don't. God's got it all in hand. Yes. Yeah. We need to just think a little bit about the relationship between evangelicalism and the Industrial Revolution, against which background it was coming into being.
Right. Now, evangelicalism isn't merely something modern, it's modernist. And a lot of fundamentalists won't be at all happy with that thought because for them, modernism was the very thing that they saw themselves or still see themselves as identified against.
Yeah, and what happened in the 20th century, and to an extent up to the present, is that fundamentalists see themselves battling against certain kinds of modern thought and ideas about the Bible that they don't like. And because of all that sound and fury that a number of us are quite used to observing, or even, perish the thought, participating in, that can blind us to the fact that evangelicalism is in itself modernist, right? And so we need to consider what those factors were. So, firstly, rationalist pragmatism. Evangelicals are highly pragmatic about the way that they operate. They do what works. And we're going to see how, a little bit in this episode, but particularly in the next episode, how they ran into resistance to all of that with their sheer pragmatism. They're predicated upon literacy, upon the knowledge of the Bible. Learning to read and write is a religious duty. They're bound to a sacred text. Mass literacy is itself a modern phenomenon made possible by print. And the evangelicals were, as it were, piggybacking on that. The work ethos, the Protestant work ethic and busyness. As we mentioned in the first episode, activism is a key aspect of being evangelical. Doing things, charity, preaching and evangelism. Being involved perhaps even in politics, but certainly being involved in society more generally. Fixing up this world for Jesus was the expression of one of the founders of Houghton College, as was waved at you and me any number of times. That's an absolute classical expression of evangelicalism. Right? It's also highly individualist. It stresses the ideas of personal responsibility and personal spiritual experience. That's very modern. And it's also skeptical about tradition, or at least it thinks it is. There are certain traditions that it hangs on to whilst insisting that's not what it's doing at all. And it also develops traditions of its own, which then become sacrosanct. But at least if you listen to its rhetoric, it's highly skeptical about tradition. So all of those things are very modern. And it means they fit well into an industrializing and fast modernizing society like Britain and a bit later America. Having mentioned America, we now need to turn to that country. We said a fair bit about it in the last episode. And whilst Jonathan Edwards was himself a Congregationalist, we noted then that not all of the Congregationalist leaders were persuaded by the new revivalism, and they looked on with some chagrin at what was going on, particularly with the rise of Methodism and so on. And here we have an 18th century Congregational minister commenting on the Methodists and why they are so successful. They're constantly mingling with the people and enter into all their feelings, wishes, and wants, and their discourses are on the level with the capacity of their hearers and addressed to their understanding and feelings and produce a thrilling effect. Our discourses shoot over their heads and they remain unaffected. They reach a large class of people that we do not. The ignorant, the drunken, the profane.
So it sounds like this minister is used to the old Puritan style, tight exposition, heavy doses of philosophical logic.
And he can see that doesn't cut it with rough and ready settlers, especially on the frontier, but that the Methodist emotionalism does.
And you'd contend that all of the denominations were discovering that they had to adapt to American social conditions.
Yes, and even geographic conditions, far-flung populations, small settlements spread over wide areas. Whereas Congregationalism, remember, it was the product of the Puritan settlers in the 1630s, and they intended to be a state church, and to an extent they were. But their ability to do that breaks down in the face of the spatial and the demographic reality. Even by the middle of the 17th century, they've got Baptists and Quakers coming in, and they imprisoned Baptists and hanged Quakers. But forgive me if I've made this joke before, as my principal political mentor Winnie the Pooh has it, in the end it just wouldn't. You know, if they're going to go off into what Roger Williams would have called the howling wilderness, are you in all seriousness going to go trekking out there to drag them back to Boston jail? To start off, the answer was yes, but in the end it was no. And it was downhill all the way from there. So by the
Right.
time you're into the 18th century, you've got an official Congregational establishment with voting rights in the New England colonies. But is it imposing itself on the whole population? No, it certainly is not. Are other denominations existing all around it? Yes, they already are. Because with a very diverse load of immigrants coming in, not just from England, but from all over the place, well, all over Europe anyway, it just can't be done. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's consider here the separate Baptists who are also affected by the Great Awakening. These are people who wanted to go for revivalism when the principal Baptist leaders didn't want to. Some Baptists in Boston were mightily impressed by George Whitefield, even though he was part of the detested Church of England. And they were impressed by the Awakening more generally. And they were appalled to find that their own leadership disapproved of adopting those methods. So they broke away to form the Second Baptist Church in 1743, and that became the beginnings of the pro-revivalist separate Baptists. And over the following decade, they acquired some prominent leaders who came over to them from the Congregationalists, most notably Isaac Backus, who we've got here.
Now, Bacchus was a strong supporter of the American Revolution, right?
Yes, yes. He came over before that, but later on he would be a supporter of the revolution. Yeah. And the separate Baptists also gained Schubel Stearns. I could not, no matter how I tried, get a portrait of him from anywhere. So they both converted to Baptist opinions about baptism and become significant Baptist leaders themselves. And although the movement begins in New England, as we just described, it eventually became stronger in the South by winning over converts from the Church of England down there, which was the established church. And as a result of those activities, they often found themselves being attacked or imprisoned. Now, moving on a bit chronologically, we need to mention the Red River Revival. And this begins in Logan County in Kentucky. This state was experiencing a rush of settlers. The population was just 73,000 people in 1790. It tripled over the next decade, and then it doubled from there by 1810 to get to about 450,000 people, something like that. Most of them were poor, hungry for land, untroubled by religion, and aggressively egalitarian. By the way, this is a point we're going to come to significantly in the next episode. Aggressive egalitarianism was a key marker of a lot of American society in the, let's say, half century after the Revolutionary War. And that's certainly true of these Kentuckians.
Now, just to say for non Americans, and maybe it's to be feared for some Americans too, we should point out that the decades after independence saw a big flow of settlers moving west of the Appalachians.
Yes, and Kentucky became a state only in 1792, following several decades of small wars against Native Americans. Yeah, it was, for Europeans at least, virgin soil. Yeah. So Presbyterian minister James McGready was the center of the Red River Revival, and he appealed to raw emotionalism that left some congregants falling over in swoons or crying aloud.
Now, this doesn't sound like very Presbyterian behavior.
Absolutely a million miles from it. Yeah, but again, this was part of the kind of Americanization of all of these different denominations. They're having to adapt, if they want to prosper at least, and win people over, to American conditions. A pretty rough and ready population who owe no automatic deference to any ecclesiastical body. They need to be wooed, not simply taken for granted. And that is, in many ways, a keynote in the early republic. Yeah. In 1800, he began camp meetings, which would be a distinctive feature of American revivalism through the 19th century and indeed on into the 20th. And although these camp meetings were mostly Presbyterian, Methodists and others were included. And this ecumenism, plus the ecstatic behavior, the late night, even all night meetings, the use of hymns rather than Presbyterian metrical psalms, and preaching by untrained people, this led to a split, because all of this is extremely un-Presbyterian, and it led to a split and the formation of the Cumberland Presbyterians, who still exist today. So, yeah, the revivalism led to splits in a number of denominations. This revivalism was general across Kentucky, and we've got a delicious account here of what happened amongst the Baptists. It's taken from A General History of the Baptist Denomination in America, in 2 volumes, published in Boston, of all places, in 1813, but it's describing events barely a decade before. And I think our author scarcely approves of what he's describing. From 1799 to 1803, there were, in most parts of the United States, remarkable outpourings of the divine spirit among different denominations. There was revival among the Baptists in the southern and western states. A quick reminder, especially for non-Americans, the western states means Tennessee and Kentucky, right? That's about as far west as we've got by this point. And astonishing additions to their churches. In Kentucky, it was computed that about 10,000 were baptized and added to the Baptist churches in the course of 2 or 3 years.
Wow.
In the camp meetings, they're assembled, in the opinion of spectators, from 4 to 10 or 12,000. Now, just to stay with that for a moment, this is an age before microphones and loudspeakers. So everybody has to be closely packed around the speaker. He has to shout at the top of his voice, a habit that's passed down, unfortunately, into the age of microphones and loudspeakers. And everybody has to keep absolutely mousy quiet. Right. And at one of them, 800 fell down under religious impressions. The falling down exercise needs no description, as it is presumed every reader will understand what is meant by it. There was also in these meetings what was called the rolling exercise, which consisted in persons being cast down in a violent manner, turned over swiftly like a log, etc. These rolling disciples often met with mud in their way and got up from their devotions in a sorrowful plight.
I love that he just assumes that everybody is familiar with these sort of spiritual tantrums.
Yeah, I think he's certainly making gentle fun as he's describing. Yeah.
Right.
Dancing was a very common practice. Many pleaded they could not help it, and others justified themselves from David's dancing before the ark and other passages of scripture. Of course, this is not exactly common in any churches at all at that point. The most singular exercise of all was the jerks. The exercise commonly began in the head, which would fly backward and forward and from side to side with a quick jolt, which the person would naturally labour to suppress, but in vain. And the more anyone laboured to stay himself and be sober, the more he staggered and the more rapidly his twitches increased.
I feel like this part, if you didn't really know what you were reading, you could almost say this sounds like a description of Woodstock or something like that.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. He must necessarily go as he was stimulated, whether with a violent dash on the ground and bounce from place to place like a football, or hop round with head, limbs, and trunk twitching and jolting in every direction as if they must inevitably fly asunder. And how such could escape without injury was no small wonder to spectators. There was among these enthusiastic people, I love that spelling, one more exercise of a most degrading nature called the barks, which frequently accompanied the jerks. Many persons of considerable distinction, in spite of all the efforts of nature, as it was said, were forced to personate that animal whose name, appropriated to a human creature, is counted the most vulgar stigma. These people would take the position of a canine beast, move about on all fours, growl, snap the teeth, and bark in so personating a manner as to set the eyes and ears of the spectator at variance. Some might be forced to these degrading exercises, but it is certain that many turned dogs in a voluntary manner. A minister in the lower parts of Kentucky informed me that it was common to hear people barking like a flock of spaniels on their way to meeting. In the upper counties in Kentucky, where the revival was greatest among the Baptists, they were not at all affected with these delirious exercises. In the Green River country and in East Tennessee, they prevailed considerably amongst them.
Wow. And some of this, I feel like, still follows Kentucky around to this day.
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe there's another few listeners who've just lost us there, but you're probably
Right.
right.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about this, and I'm sure someone will correct me in the comments, but I think this may be where we get the expression barking mad
Oh,
from.
right. That wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, well, to move on to something a little more, or maybe a little bit less wholesome, and we'll look at abolition now. And this is really about the slave trade, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And Britain was the prime culprit of it. Certainly, other countries conducted the slave trade a little bit the 16th century, 17th, and 18th. But by the 18th, the British had the lion's share of it. And yet the campaign to stop it begins there. So we, of course, quoted that famous hymn by John Newton at the start of this episode. So here he is. And he has a very colourful biography. He's born in London in 1725, and he went to sea with his father at age 11. And at age 18, he was press ganged into the Royal Navy.
Now, for non-Brits, you'd better explain what the press gang was, because I'm assuming it's not a mob of journalists.
Sadly, no. The Royal Navy, even in the 18th century, was already the preeminent navy in the world. Didn't completely rule the waves at that point, but that was coming. And yet, it was so horrible to serve in that not enough people would willingly volunteer to do so. And so gangs were sent ashore to grab any fit-looking young man and simply say, you, mate, you are now in the Navy. You come with us. And there were all kinds of deplorable episodes of this sort. I mean, there were stories even of bridegrooms being dragged away from their weddings and pulled onto Royal Navy ships. Yeah.
Wow.
So he was press ganged, but shortly after, he was transferred to a slave ship bound for West Africa. Now, I'm not quite sure how that happened, actually, because a slave ship is clearly not going to be part of the Royal Navy. He ended up, though, being made a slave himself in what's now Sierra Leone in 1745.
It seems like the slave trade wasn't completely a one-way street then. If Europeans could be enslaved by Africans in at least a very few cases.
Yeah, I think it was pretty rare, but it could happen, and in his case, it did. But he was fortunate within 2 or 3 years. By early 1748, he was rescued by someone actually sent out by his father to look for him. And on his way back to England, he had a conversion experience in the ship, although he later denied that was a true conversion. It's probably impossible to know very much about this, but one suspects that he was embarrassed later on in his life about the fact that even though he'd had a conversion, he spent the next 6 years serving on slave ships, which later in his life he came to recognize as absolutely evil. So maybe it was the later Newton wanting to reflect back in that way. So until 1754, he serves on them, and on the last 3 occasions, he was the captain. But then in 1754, he gives up seagoing. He retreated into private life. He studied the biblical languages and became a lay preacher, finally being ordained in the Church of England in 1764, and became rector of a church in central London. And from 1788, so he's been sitting on this now for more than 30 years, he finally breaks his silence and starts to campaign against slavery. And he wrote against it. He was a mentor to Wilberforce and Hannah More, who are both extremely important in the abolitionist campaign. And of course, he's most famous today for his hymns, especially Amazing Grace, which, I mean, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if people who are expert in these things were to say that it's the most famous hymn in the world. It's certainly got very wide recognition. Yeah.
Right.
Now, we just mentioned Wilberforce. Here he is, 1759 to 1833.
Now, Wilberforce came from a much more privileged background than Newton did.
Yeah, he certainly did. A very wealthy background. As a young man, he was sent on the Grand Tour, which was what wealthy young aristocrats and people of similar kind of background did in the 18th century to pick up a little culture, particularly in places like Switzerland and Italy. And when he got back home, he was able actually to buy a seat in Parliament. And this is because of the existence of the rotten boroughs at the time. Now, it was a complicated system, the House of Commons at that point. It's much more straightforward today. But there were a number of parliamentary constituencies which had only 2 or 3 electors in them. And so if you paid them a certain amount of money, they would choose you to represent them in Parliament. And he did this. And he spent most of the rest of his life in Parliament, but he used his position there campaigning for all kinds of good causes, and especially for the abolition of the slave trade. Here we've got a speech that he made in the House of Commons in 1789. He was unsuccessful, as he was in many following attempts, but in the end he did get there. But this is the kind of case that he makes. Sir, he's addressing himself to the Speaker of the House of Commons, the nature and the circumstances of this trade are now laid open to us. We can no longer plead ignorance. We cannot evade it. We may spurn it, we may kick it out of the way, but we cannot turn aside so as to avoid seeing it. For it is brought now so directly before our eyes that this House must decide and must justify to all the world and to its own conscience the rectitude of the grounds of its decision. Let not Parliament be the only body that's insensible to the principles of natural justice. He's speaking there as though the wider population in the country were opposed to the slave trade, which is not certain at this point. Certainly there were very many people who did want to bring this to an end. Let us make reparation to Africa as far as we can by establishing trade upon true commercial principles, and we shall soon find the rectitude of our conduct rewarded by the benefits of a regular and growing commerce.
Pretty good stuff.
Pretty good stuff. Yes, it is. He gets support from Wesley. Now, by this stage, Wesley will already have been an old man, but he sends Wilberforce this letter. My dear sir, unless the divine providence has raised you up to be an Athanasius contra mundum, I see not how you can go through with your glorious enterprise.
Now, just to go back, that Latin expression, what exactly is Wesley referring to?
Okay, Athanasius was a 4th century bishop. He was Bishop of Alexandria, and then he was deposed, and then he was reinstated, and then he was deposed, and then he was reinstated. He spent his whole life battling against Arian heresy. He was a supporter of the doctrine of the Trinity. And the expression Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the whole world, becomes a sort of byword for a person who is prepared to stand up against everybody for what they know to be true. And that's what Wesley's referring to here. So unless God has raised you up to be an Athanasius contra mundum, I see not how you can go through with your glorious enterprise in opposing that execrable villainy which is the scandal of religion, of England, and of human nature. Unless God has raised you up for this very thing, you'll be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. But if God is with you, who can be against you? Are all of them stronger than God? Oh, be not weary in well-doing. Go on in the name of God and in the power of his might, till even American slavery, the vilest that ever saw the sun, shall vanish away before it, that he who has guided you from your youth up may continue to strengthen you in this and in all things, is the prayer of, dear sir, your affectionate servant, John Wesley.
Wow, that must have really encouraged him. Not only is that a great letter, but to get it from Wesley himself is pretty cool.
Right. Yes. Yes. The slave trade was finally abolished in 1807. And by that stage, Britannia definitely did rule the waves and so was able to impose a cessation of the slave trade on pretty much everybody else. It used its navy for that purpose. But the institution of slavery continued to exist. So the trade had been stopped, but people who were already slaves remained slaves. And so Wilberforce and his fellow workers continue their campaign, and slavery is not finally ended until 1833. Interestingly, Newton lived just long enough to see the slave trade abolished in 1807, and Wilberforce just long enough to see slavery itself ended in 1833 and then died.
Wow.
So we've got a couple of books here that I'd like to recommend to people, both by Stephen Tompkins.
Yes, we're back with your former doctoral student here. He's published quite a lot, hasn't he?
Yeah, he has, particularly popular biographies. So one of Wilberforce and another one of the Clapham sect. Now, the name is misleading because it wasn't actually a sect at all. It was simply what people called Wilberforce and his friends, like Newton, like Hannah More, like various others who were involved in this campaign. But the Clapham sect was campaigning for more than just this. They wanted to raise the moral tone of the whole country and put an end to a whole load of social evils. And you could say that in many respects, perhaps not directly, they did in the end succeed in bringing about a whole load of reforms inside the country. Yeah. Here we are, changing the culture, the rise of evangelicalism in early 19th century Britain.
Yeah, and so now we come to what is really the central point of this episode, that the real impact of the Great Awakening didn't come until several generations later. And it was through the more mundane evangelism of ordinary churches and ordinary Christians.
Yes. Apart from being historically wrong, I think the sort of heroic account of the Great Awakening is unhelpful because it distracts us to look at heroic preachers as the agents of change. Whereas if you actually look at the numbers and break this down, and then you start to look at measurable social changes, it's brought about by the churches that are thereby established. It's not that the Great Awakeners don't matter, they matter very much, but they just push the first few pebbles and then things start to move from there. But the actions of just ordinary congregations and of their members over generations really, really count. Yes. Before we get properly into the 19th century, we just need to flip back one more time into the late 18th to look at Robert Raikes, because he introduces something that has a huge impact. And that is, he invents the Sunday school. He is writing in 1783 here. Some of the clergy in different parts of the country bent upon establishing Sunday schools for the rendering of the Lord's Day subservient to the ends of instruction, which has hitherto been prostituted to bad purposes. Now, I suspect that most of us would want to bang our foreheads at this point and say he's probably pointing to things that aren't really bad at all. They're simply things like going to the pub, playing sports and games and so on after church. So he's probably tilting towards a kind of strict Sabbatarianism there, right? But he says to remedy this evil, persons duly qualified are employed to instruct those that may have learned to read, are taught the catechism, and conducted to church. By thus keeping their minds engaged, the day passes profitably and not disagreeably. In those parishes where this plan has been adopted, we are assured that the behaviour of the children is greatly civilised. Well, he's starting off the Sunday school, which rapidly spreads. Within the first few years, it leaps across the Atlantic and spreads equally fast in America. Until by the time you get far into the 19th century and in the 20th as well, the whole idea of Sunday school is axiomatic.
Right.
Just think of Mark Twain writing about Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn and the Sunday schools there. Everybody knew what Sunday schools were. They were a well-established institution. When are those stories supposed to take place? The 1830s, I think, something like that. It's just like within half a century, it is an axiom, both sides of the Atlantic. And it's Raikes that gets it going. And a lot of it focused upon teaching children to read. Because there weren't state schools, there were a lot of schools, but they were all private, and some people couldn't either afford the fees or they needed their children to go out to work. They couldn't afford to spare them from labour. So Sunday school was all the education they got, but they did at least learn to read. I talked about numbers a moment ago. Here are some statistics of 19th century nonconformity. So without going through all of these, let's look at the central column, which lumps all the Methodist groups together. So in 1800, there are still, for all the sound and fury of the Great Awakening, only 93,793 converts. But by 1850, that's leapt to nearly 500,000, and by 1900 to nearly 750,000. The Congregationalists, in 1800, there are 35,000. By mid-century, there's about 5 times as many. And they shoot above the 250,000 mark by 1900. The Baptists, in 1800, that's particulars and generals put together, 27,000. Frankly, that's pathetic. There had been 60,000 of them in 1660, 140 years earlier. But thanks to hyper-Calvinism on the one hand and backsliding into Unitarianism on the other, they have sunk right down and they're only just starting to come back up. But by 1900, they're up to nearly 250,000. The point I'm making is that the effects of this Great Awakening snowball over the succeeding generations.
Yeah.
Let's finish here with just a few examples of this kind of thing and come to this man, Charles Simeon. And we've got his dates here, 1759 to 1836, and a delightful portrait.
Yes, he does look a bit odd here.
Yeah, he does. And he wasn't very popular at first when he became minister of Holy Trinity Church in Cambridge. But he eventually won a large audience for his evangelical views among generations of undergraduates. Now, at the time, he was a lonely figure, or a lone figure, let's put it that way, within this university. But he had a huge influence upon generations of undergraduates. If he's appointed in 1783, he's there for 53 years, right? And his church was packed, and his influence in the wider country was generally estimated to be greater than that of most bishops, even though he's never more than a parish minister.
Wow.
Let's come to someone who everybody will have heard of.
Oh my! Are we going to talk about Jane Austen? Was she actually an evangelical?
We have no evidence that she was. But what we want to do is point out her changing attitude in the early 19th century, which is just one indication of the way things were going. In 1809, she wrote to her older sister that I do not like the evangelicals. Now, she comes from a clergy household, actually. Her father was a parish minister. But 5 years later, she changed her opinion. I'm by no means convinced that we ought not all to be evangelicals. And this growing seriousness is reflected in her novels. So, in Pride and Prejudice, which, although it was published in 1813, it had actually been written in the 1790s. The clergyman, Mr. Collins, as we will all remember, Mr. Collins, is presented as a ludicrous and repulsive figure of fun. Right? Whereas in Mansfield Park, published in 1814 and written just before, Edmund Bertram, who faces ridicule for his desire to be ordained, is the hero for his principle, for his upstanding character. So that doesn't make Jane Austen an evangelical, but it's an indication that there's a change in sensibility, if we can use that word in respect of Jane Austen, going on, right?
Right.
Now, this next slide is completely unforgivable. It is extremely, it's almost a caricature. But if we want to envisage something, here on the left we have necklines, not quite typical, but certainly not unusual, before 1820, so Regency period, and then in 1854. And they can do service for a change in social attitudes, greater seriousness sweeping across society as a whole. By the mid-century, evangelicals were affecting the overall tone of British society and indeed of American society. Reached their apogee around the same time. The trajectory of how they get there is a little different. We're going to spend all our time in the next episode looking at America during this period.
At the risk of sounding like an older person than I am, we could probably use a little bit of reform in the in the styles and appearances of people today.
Yeah, we probably could, yes. So, yeah, it's a crude way of representing this, but nevertheless, it's not without significance. That is not a coincidence. Let's finish with just another little for instance here, and it's this man, Anthony Ashley Cooper, 7th Earl of Shaftesbury. Like Wilberforce, a man brought up to privilege, though he had a rather tragic boyhood. But he spent his career in the House of Lords, which had a lot more influence on the political process then than it would have in the 20th century. So it still had a lot of influence, even though government was mostly located already in the Commons. Using his position, he sponsored a number of reform bills motivated by his evangelical faith. So the Coal Mines Act of 1842 excluded women and girls from working underground and limited the working of boys.
It's easy to twitch at that, and I know for most people today, it's a mystery why such terrible working conditions were even allowed in the first place.
But the Industrial Revolution was something new. Before the Industrial Revolution, there was nothing remotely cruel about getting your children to work. All children had to work, or we would starve to death, right? But there was a huge difference between working in and around the home under the supervision of parents who cared for them and were desperate to keep them alive, and going out to work, which is not part of the order of nature. It's something largely created by the Industrial Revolution, where children are under the supervision of an overseer who has no particular interest in them. They are especially useful because they can fit into crevices within machinery that adults can't, and all this sort of thing. And of course, it's extremely dangerous. Yes. Yeah, the Earl of Shaftesbury, that terrible sexist man, deprived women and girls from being allowed to work underground in coal mines. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. We will move swiftly on. The Lunacy Act of 1845 established asylums for the mentally ill. And even though those institutions have been hugely criticized in recent times for some of the people they took in, nevertheless, they were a big improvement on what had gone before, where people who were mentally ill had been kept in prison. So this did represent a real advance. And the Factory Act of 1847, which he also pushed, limited the work week in textile mills for women and for children under 18. He was also chairman of the Ragged Schools Union. So there isn't compulsory state schooling in Britain until the 1870s. So this precedes that. So these were charitable schools providing basic education for ragged children, the poor. He was president of the British and Foreign Bible Society.
And we have mentioned the British and Foreign Bible Society before. And so if you're interested in the origins of that, you can go back and see the second episode in this series.
Yes, that's right. And he's an early and leading proponent of Christian Zionism. For example, his 1839 article in the press, The State and the Rebirth of the Jews.
Yeah, now, such ideas would become even more prominent in America than in Britain. So, if you're looking for more information about that, you can go back and look at our very first episode in our very first series, which is about American Christians and Israel.
Yes, please do that. Yeah.
You can criticize whether we've changed very much since then or not.
We might be unrecognizable if somebody tunes into our very first episode.
Right.
I hope we've improved our production techniques at least a little bit.
Probably. Now, for the final episode in this series, we're going to be looking at how new evangelistic strategies emerged, particularly the new measures that were introduced by Charles Grandison Finney, and then how those shaped the behavior of evangelicals pretty much down to the present.
Yes, the next and last episode in this series is going to be entirely about those American affairs. Finney is going to be the centerpiece, but we're going to be looking very much at the context of popular revivalism and the upsurge in, I suppose we could call it, aggressive egalitarianism in America during the half century after independence, and how that all fits together. Yes.
Okay, so hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Maybe learned something new about the Great Awakening, maybe inspired by some of these people that we mentioned. I personally am going to be picking up a biography of Wilberforce at some point. So yeah, but if you guys enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would share it on social media, share it with your friends, share it with your mom. I don't know, annoy somebody with it. We would really appreciate it. And yeah.
Yeah, extra brownie points in heaven for annoying your mom with our videos.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, we will see you in the next episode, people. Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.
Bye, everyone.